And as Eskom's wage talks get underway, the National Employees Association of South Africa says centralized collective bargaining leads to unemployment. CEO Gerard Papenfus joins us now in studio. Thanks for your time, sir. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Sean.
So I've looked at what you wrote here in this opinion piece, and you say that it is a major concern, that it's the biggest deterrent to employment in affected companies. Tell us why.
The South African model of collective bargaining gives dominance to big business. And the reason for that is that when agreements are extended, and that's where the issue is, the extension of agreements. The minister which ultimately decided the extension doesn't look at the number of companies requesting it to extend, but you look at the number of employees employed by those companies. So you have a situation where a few companies, and this is what's happening, collective bargaining in South Africa is run by a minority. Big businesses which extend agreements which they can't afford because they're under pressure from unions and strikes, so they make a deal and then pass that, the impact of that deal onto to non-parties, which are mainly SMMEs. And big business are price givers. They can actually incorporate the impact of the wage into their products and pass it on to the downstream. So the downstream employer actually pays twice. And he can't pass it on to the public, to the consumer, and that leads to, I mean, the moment the wage impact becomes so heavy, you stop manufacturing and start importing finished products. This is what's happening. And what we say is we need to bring democracy back into these deals, where you count an employer as an employer, as you count a voter, whether it's rich or poor, he's a voter. If rich people were the only people that could vote, we would have had a completely different dispensation. But the balance is that the poor man can also vote. And whilst that applies in South Africa, generally, that doesn't apply in collective bargaining. So it has a huge impact on the downstream when it gets to the extension of agreement.
Now, the PSA, when it came to the threat of a public servant strike, mentioned this about the bargaining council, the collective bargaining process. It said that it was not in the interests of workers.
Yeah.
And that, of course, that argument was brushed aside because the majority of unions signed what government was offering. So when it comes to unions and how they treat the collective bargaining process, that, of course, is quite important.
Well, unions benefit through the system. I mean, collective bargaining is a source of income for trade unions. I mean, that makes it in. Unions do not have the capacity anymore to do shop floor bargaining. So it's an easy system of negotiating. Now, we're not against collective bargaining. We are in favor of collective bargaining because it makes it just for everybody much easier. What we're against the extension of agreements in the manner that is currently taking place. And I think what is the smaller unions very often can complain about is the fact that bigger unions can reach agreements with employers and make the threshold so high that it simply closes the door for new entries into the market. So the unemployed does not benefit through collective bargaining. So those stats, and that's always been the problem with collective bargaining, is it is exclusive in nature. Once you're in, you benefit. But the system is shrinking all the time. It's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And the burden on South Africa in terms of unemployment will become simply too heavy at some stage. Collective bargaining, when unions are representing their members, they go in and look at what is the highest possible wage that they can get. Well, that leaves the unemployed completely out of the loop. And it's wrong. We need to negotiate on two levels. First of all, if there's negotiations, then negotiate on the lowest level, the lowest common denominator, and let companies themselves negotiate a higher wage, those that can afford it. But you cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach, which is currently the case in many industries, where you agree that the big companies sitting in the economic hubs of South Africa, mainly Johannesburg, Pretoria, Durban, Cape Town, they make deals and then pass on those deals to little companies in rural areas. The economic realities in every single respect is completely different.
Yeah.
And that's why you simply cannot create work. And I mean, we see business closures. I sit on a weekly basis, and I am surprised when I see companies being closed on a weekly basis. And I'm simply surprised they just cannot continue with this burden.
Now, you say that what's most concerning is the blatant dishonesty of employers who defend the system.
Yeah.
They're obviously doing it because it works in their own interest.
Well, monopoly capital benefits through the system. It is, if you, and I say there that the cost of a wage as a percentage of turnover, in the case of a big business, it can be as low as 1% or below 5%. In the case of small business, it can be as high as 50% and even higher. Now, if you agree, under threat of a strike, agree on a 10% wage increase, which you can't afford. But first of all, you get exemption. You can get exemption from your own deal. Now, that doesn't make sense, and that's why it's very easy to sign a deal. Ask for exemption. The second thing is you pass on, you extend that deal to another employer, which is not part of that deal, but you make it compulsory on him. But in the first place, this big guy, the impact of that wage isn't that much, but for the guy in the downstream, the small guy employing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to 10 people, which is 90% of employees, for him it's devastating, and he cannot pass it on. The argument is he can get exemption. What applies in all cases? You get exemption, most cases, no, it's actually all cases, when you can prove that you're almost bankrupt. Now, that's too late. You cannot grow on the basis of, there are other reasons why you must be able to get exemption, but you cannot base a system on the basis of, if you can't afford to get an exemption, the system cannot carry that.
So the system, you say, is flawed in that way. But what about the rights of workers who would say that we fought for a 10% in one company and we deserve it, but now the implication is that a smaller company has to also give that 10% wage increase? Given that they're in the same sector, should they not get the 10%, even though their company is small, or even though the company might not be able to afford it? Well,
if you can't afford it, you can't pay it. If a small company cannot afford it, you simply can't pay it. You know, employers, and I say it there, employers pay what they can afford. If they pay if things they do not impact on the sustainability of the business, they pay it if they don't want to pay it. That's the reality. The moment you interfere with that, employers say we don't pay. Now, if you look at, I mean, there's a decline in jobs constantly. The steel industry lost 100,000 jobs. Well, no, they lost more than that. But the steel industry is 100,000 jobs down in a period of 10 years. 25% of the industry is out of the industry. The industry has shrank with 25%. Now, one must have a look at what is the reason, and the wages are the main reason. There are other reasons. There are global economic reasons. There's the issue of steel, etc. But wages is the main cause of this. And the fact is, we're not helping anybody. We're not helping anybody. And when the market factors becomes the determining factor, companies compete. If you're a good worker and if you want to be retained, companies want to retain you, well, they pay you for that. I mean, there are companies that, of course, big and small, that's paying much more than the required rate. But you cannot force, in the metal industry, which was at some stage the flagship of bargaining councils, which is now bankrupt, the cost, the minimum wage, entry-level wage is 10,000 Rand cost to company for a worker that's not skilled at all. Now, that's simply too high. You cannot enter the market without skills on that level.
Yeah.
The market simply cannot bear that.
Okay, thank you so much for your time and your insight. We do appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.
Papenfus, joining us on the labour market and the bargaining council in particular. Now,